Imagine the scene, a chamber in the Palace of Whitehall in the late 16th century, heavy with the scent of wilting herbs strewn across the floor and the animalic tang of expensive, overpowering perfume. Here, a queen, a figure meant to be a living embodiment of divine perfection, holds court, her face a stark white mask of Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste of vinegar and toxic white lead. This was the reality for history's most powerful women, a far cry from the sparkling, sanitized fairy tales we imagine. Their world, draped in silk and velvet, was not a sanctuary of cleanliness, but a gilded cage of profound and dangerous filth, where the battle for survival was fought not just in the political arena, but against an invisible tide of bacteria, parasites, and self-inflicted poison. What follows is not a story of palaces, but of prisons, prisons of the flesh, where hygiene was a concept so alien that its absence shaped destinies and brought empires to their knees. We must peel back the perfumed layers of myth to reveal the truly disgusting and often lethal habits of the women who once wore the crown. This journey into the royal boudoir is a descent into a world where the stench of decay was the true scent of power, and where the most intimate daily routines were a dance with death itself, a grotesque ballet of ignorance and tradition that festered at the very heart of civilization. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to continue making videos like this every day, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. To truly comprehend the seemingly incomprehensible squalor of a royal court, we must first abandon our modern minds and enter a world governed not by science, but by scent and superstition. For centuries, the prevailing medical orthodoxy was the theory of miasma, a belief as pervasive and toxic as the stenches it sought to explain. This doctrine held that disease, from the common cold to the Black Death, was not caused by microscopic organisms, a concept that would have sounded like pure fantasy, but by bad air or night air, a poisonous vapor emanating from rotting organic matter, swamps, and the unburied dead. Consequently, the entire framework of health and hygiene was oriented around controlling smell, not eliminating its source. To smell sweet was to be safe. To smell foul was to be vulnerable to the invisible clouds of pestilence that drifted through city streets and palace corridors alike. This intellectual prison explains the baffling paradox of aristocratic life, the obsessive use of powerful perfumes, fragrant pomanders clutched in delicate hands, and clothes doused in floral waters, all while the body beneath remained unwashed for weeks, months, or even a lifetime. A bath was seen as a profoundly dangerous act, an opening of the body's pores that would leave one susceptible to the airborne poisons of the miasma. Water, especially hot water, was believed to weaken the constitution and invite sickness in. Therefore, a queen avoiding a full immersion bath was not being negligent. By the logic of her time, she was practicing sound preventative medicine, armor, plating her soul against the foul breath of the world. This fundamental misunderstanding is the key that unlocks the entire ghastly spectacle of royal hygiene. It was not a matter of laziness or a preference for filth, but a rigorously applied, if catastrophically wrong, system of belief where perfume was penicillin and a good, thick layer of grime was a shield from God's most terrifying plagues. This world did not differentiate between a sewer and a sickbed in terms of their ethereal threat, and so the fight against disease was waged with incense and ambergris, not soap and water. A fragrant war fought on a battlefield of profound ignorance, where the very air a queen breathed was considered her most potent and unpredictable enemy. The gilded cage of royalty was, in essence, a perfumed gas chamber, where the occupants desperately tried to sweeten the air they were breathing while slowly being poisoned by the filth they refused to wash away. A tragic irony that would define the lives and deaths of countless royal women for hundreds of years. In the medieval world, this fear of water and miasma was powerfully fused with the doctrines of the Christian faith, creating a formidable psychological barrier to cleanliness. The early church fathers had looked upon the bathhouses of the fallen Roman Empire not as marvels of engineering and public health, but as dens of sin, places of licentious behavior, vanity, and hedonistic indulgence. Bathing for pleasure was seen as a gateway to temptation, a dangerous flirtation with the sins of the flesh. Therefore, physical grime became strangely entangled with spiritual purity. To renounce the pleasures of the bath was to demonstrate piety and a rejection of worldly vanity. A foul-smelling, unkempt body could be interpreted as a sign of a soul focused on the hereafter, not on the fleeting comforts of the mortal coil. Royal women, whose lives were public performances of power and piety, were particularly susceptible to this mode of thought. A queen like St. Margaret of Scotland, canonized for her charity and religious devotion in the 11th century, was also noted for her ascetic practices, which would have almost certainly included the rejection of regular bathing as an unnecessary luxury. Fasting and enduring physical discomfort, including the dirt of one's own body, were seen as ways to mortify the flesh and thus elevate the spirit. This mindset reached its apogee with figures like Queen Isabella I of Castile, a ruler of immense power and fervent, militant piety, who financed the voyages of Columbus and oversaw the Spanish Inquisition. Her infamous, and likely apocryphal, boast that she had only bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before her marriage, has become a shorthand for medieval filth. While the quote itself is probably a later invention, a piece of anti-Spanish propaganda, it captures a kernel of truth about the era's values. For a woman like Isabella, a public display of extreme piety was a vital political tool, reinforcing her image as a divinely appointed ruler. In a culture that conflated sanctity with self-denial, a reputation for avoiding the bath could be more valuable than a reputation for cleanliness. The baths that did occur were often highly ritualized, ceremonial, or strictly medicinal, prescribed by a physician to treat an ailment, not for the mundane purpose of removing dirt. These were not relaxing soaks but clinical procedures, often involving herbal infusions intended to rebalance the body's humors, another cornerstone of pre-modern medicine. The very idea of a daily wash, a concept we take for granted, would have been seen as dangerously eccentric at best and sinfully self-indulgent at worst. Thus, the medieval queen existed in a state of suspended filth, her body a testament to her piety, her odor a mark of her devotion, living a life where the road to heaven was paved not with good intentions, but with an unyielding layer of sacred royal grime. Let us now push open the heavy, brocade curtain door into the queen's private bedchamber, the supposed inner sanctum of the palace. We are not greeted by an airy, sunlit space, but by a thick, cloying atmosphere, a sensory assault that speaks of a profound and systemic lack of sanitation. This was not a haven but a biohazard, a small, enclosed ecosystem of human waste and creeping decay. The most glaring absence, to our modern sensibilities, is plumbing. There were no flushing toilets, no elegant ensuite bathrooms. The primary method of waste disposal was the chamber pot, a ceramic or pewter bowl that was the constant, malodorous companion of every royal. These pots, once used, were not immediately whisked away and sterilized. They would often sit in the room for hours, sometimes tucked under the bed or behind a screen, their contents emitting a sharp ammoniac stench that would mingle with the smells of stale food, unwashed bodies, and heavy perfumes. The task of emptying them fell to a legion of servants, who would simply carry the pots to the nearest window and hurl the contents into the courtyard or moat below, creating a permanent miasma that hung over even the most magnificent palaces. The role of the groom of the stool for the king is infamous, a high-ranking courtier tasked with the intimate duty of attending to the monarch's bowel movements. While the role was less formalized for queens, the principle remained the same. The most basic human functions were public, or at least semi-public, acts, attended by servants whose proximity to the royal body granted them a strange form of prestige. Imagine the sheer lack of privacy, the constant presence of others in one's most vulnerable moments. The floors of these chambers added another layer to the squalor. Before the widespread use of expensive carpets, floors were covered with rushes or straw. On the surface, this seems rustic and natural, but in reality, these floor coverings were a nightmare of filth. They were rarely changed, with new layers simply being thrown on top of the old. They became a compressed, slowly composting mat of everything that was dropped or spilled: food scraps, grease, spittle, ale, and even the urine and feces from domestic animals that often roamed freely through the palace. The Dutch humanist Erasmus, visiting England in the early 16th century, wrote with disgust of these floors, describing a bottom layer that could remain undisturbed for 20 years, harboring expectoration, vomit, the urine of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. This was the ground a queen walked upon in her own private rooms. It was a space that defied the very concept of sanctuary, a room where the air was thick with the evidence of life in all its unsanitized reality, and where the constant, low-level assault of stench and filth was an inescapable part of the royal condition. We now arrive at the court of Elizabeth I of England, a monarch who cultivated one of the most powerful and enduring images in history, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a figure of almost supernatural purity and strength. Her public persona was a masterpiece of propaganda, a carefully constructed facade of timeless, untouchable perfection. Yet, beneath the pearls and ruffs, the reality was one of striking and ultimately fatal squalor. Elizabeth's most famous and perhaps most revealing quote on the subject of hygiene was her reported declaration that she took a bath once a month, whether she needed it or not. This statement, intended to portray her as unusually and perhaps even excessively clean by the standards of her day, is to a modern ear a confession of appalling filth. To go 4 weeks without washing one's entire body, while encased in layers of heavy, sweat-absorbing fabric, and living in a crowded, unsanitary palace, would create a formidable personal odor, one that even the strongest perfumes could only partially mask. The courtiers who surrounded her, all living by a similar standard, would have created a collective atmosphere of overwhelming body odor, a human stench that we can barely conceive of. But the Queen's hygienic deficiencies went far beyond her bathing habits. Her reign coincided with the arrival of sugar as a luxury item in England, and Elizabeth developed a notorious sweet tooth. She consumed vast quantities of sugared fruits, candies, and marzipan, with devastating consequences for her dental health. By the end of her life, her teeth were described by foreign ambassadors as blackened stumps, rotten to the gums. The resulting pain would have been excruciating and the halitosis overpowering. A French ambassador once noted that her teeth were so black that it was difficult to understand her speech, a shocking detail that reveals the intimate reality of conversing with the most powerful woman in the world. To conceal the visible signs of aging and the scars left by a near-fatal bout of smallpox in her late 20s, Elizabeth turned to a deadly cosmetic, Venetian ceruse. This was a thick, white paste made from white lead and vinegar, which she slathered onto her face, neck, and hands. It gave her the porcelain, mask-like complexion seen in her famous portraits, but it was also a slow-acting poison. The lead was absorbed through her skin over decades, likely causing a host of health problems, including hair loss, digestive issues, and cognitive decline. In a tragic irony, the very tool she used to project an image of immortal purity was actively corrupting her body from within, a perfect metaphor for the Elizabethan court itself. A glittering surface of power and poetry, hiding a core of decay and death. The Virgin Queen's image was, in the end, an illusion painted in poison over a canvas of grime. The quest for the aristocratic ideal of beauty, a pale and unchanging visage, drove royal women to use their own faces and bodies as toxic chemical palettes. The use of Venetian ceruse by Elizabeth I was not an isolated case but the gold standard in a continent-wide cosmetic regime that amounted to a form of ritualized self-poisoning. The desired look was one of stark, almost ghostly, pallor, a visual signifier that a woman did not toil in the sun like a common laborer. To achieve this, women would coat their skin in lead, day after day, year after year. The immediate effects were a smooth, porcelain finish that covered blemishes, freckles, and scars, but the cumulative impact was catastrophic. The lead would cause the skin to dry out, wrinkle, and become discolored, creating a vicious cycle where more and more of the toxic makeup was needed to cover the damage it had itself created. Chronic lead poisoning, or plumism, would manifest in a terrifying array of symptoms: severe abdominal pain, memory loss, irritability, paralysis, and eventually, total organ failure. It was a slow, agonizing decline, all in the name of a fashionable complexion. But lead was not the only poison in the royal makeup case. To add a touch of color to the ghostly white canvas, Women would use vermilion for their lips and cheeks. Vermilion was a bright red pigment made from powdered cinnabar, which is a mineral form of mercury sulfide. Mercury, another potent neurotoxin, was readily absorbed through the skin or inhaled as dust. It could cause tremors, tooth loss, insanity, and death. To make their eyes appear larger, more luminous, and more alluring, women would use drops of belladonna, derived from the deadly nightshade plant. Belladonna works by blocking the nerve receptors that control the eye muscles, causing the pupils to dilate dramatically. While it created a striking doe-eyed effect, it also caused blurred vision, heart palpitations, and, with prolonged use, could lead to blindness. The very name, belladonna, translates to beautiful woman, a chillingly direct testament to its purpose. Kohl, used to outline the eyes, was often made from antimony or lead sulfide, adding yet another layer of heavy metals to the toxic cocktail. This daily ritual of beautification was, in essence, a slow-motion suicide, a testament to the extreme lengths women would go to conform to a deadly and artificial standard of beauty. The royal face was not a reflection of health, but a carefully constructed mask of poison, a fragile, painted death's head that concealed the creeping decay beneath. The pursuit of beauty was not just skin deep, it was a deep, systemic poisoning of the entire body. Nowhere was the paradox of magnificent squalor more pronounced than at the Palace of Versailles, the glittering epicenter of European power and culture in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Conceived by Louis XIV, the Sun King, as the ultimate expression of absolute monarchy, Versailles was an architectural masterpiece, a sprawling complex of breathtaking halls, manicured gardens, and opulent apartments designed to awe and intimidate. Yet, this monument to human ambition had a fatal flaw, one so fundamental it seems almost unbelievable. It was built with virtually no latrines or plumbing. With thousands of aristocrats, servants, soldiers, and visitors thronging the palace daily, the logistics of human waste became a crisis of monumental proportions. The primary solution remained the humble chamber pot, but in the vast, labyrinthine corridors of Versailles, the system broke down completely. Courtiers, caught short far from their own quarters, would not hesitate to relieve themselves in any available corner, in stairwells, behind decorative tapestries, in unused fireplaces, and even on the grand balconies overlooking the pristine gardens. The sheer scale of the palace made it impossible for the overwhelmed servants to keep up. The result was a pervasive, inescapable stench that hung over the entire estate, a miasma of urine and feces that even the strongest perfume struggled to conquer. One princess, writing in her diary, complained that she was often forced to hold her nose as she walked through the supposedly elegant hallways. The gardens themselves, with their geometric perfection, became a de facto public toilet for the less inhibited members of the court. Royal women had to navigate this perfumed cesspool with grace and decorum, pretending not to notice the filth that was literally underfoot. Their elaborate silk gowns, with their long trains, would trail through hallways stained with urine. Their delicate shoes would tread on unseen human and animal waste. The palace air, thick with the odors of thousands of unwashed bodies crammed into close quarters, was an invisible but ever-present assault. It was a world of extreme sensory contradiction, where the sight of glittering chandeliers and priceless art was accompanied by the smell of a neglected latrine. This was the stage upon which the high drama of the French court played out, a world where absolute power resided amidst absolute filth, and where the daily life of a royal woman involved a constant, heroic effort to maintain an illusion of delicacy and refinement in an environment that was, in reality, a magnificent, open sewer. Within this fragrant dystopia of the French court, one figure stands out as a symbol of change, albeit a relative and misunderstood one: Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born Queen of France became notorious among the old guard at Versailles for what they considered a bizarre and decadent obsession with cleanliness. Unlike the vast majority of her aristocratic peers, Marie Antoinette adored bathing. She had a portable, cloth-lined bathtub brought to her private chambers and would take frequent, full-immersion baths, a practice seen as both wildly extravagant and vaguely suspicious. She favored baths scented with sweet almonds, pine nuts, and linseed, creating her own personal oasis of fragrant water amidst the general squalor of the palace. These bathing rituals were elaborate affairs, requiring servants to haul buckets of heated water to her rooms, and they became a subject of court gossip. To the French nobility, who adhered to the dry-clean method of rubbing the skin with a perfumed cloth, the queen's habit was seen as a strange foreign custom, another piece of evidence of her otherness, her failure to properly assimilate into the rigid etiquette of Versailles. However, we must view her cleanliness through the correct historical lens. While she bathed far more than her contemporaries, her habits were still a world away from modern hygiene. Soap, as we know it, a detergent for scrubbing away dirt and germs, was not a standard feature of these baths. They were more about perfuming the skin and the pleasure of immersion than about vigorous antiseptic cleaning. She was still a product of the miasma theory, believing that scent was paramount to health. Her preference for bathing was an aesthetic and sensual one, not a scientific one based on an understanding of germ theory. Tragically, this very personal and relatively harmless habit was twisted into a weapon against her during the French Revolution. In the torrent of slanderous pamphlets and cartoons that preceded her execution, her love of bathing was portrayed as yet another example of her decadent, self-indulgent, and wasteful nature. Her extravagant baths were contrasted with the poverty and suffering of the common people, becoming a symbol of her disconnect from the nation she was supposed to rule. It is a bitter irony that one of the few things that brought Marie Antoinette closer to our modern standards of hygiene was used to paint her as a monster, a clear demonstration of how even the most intimate personal habits can become politicized in a time of revolutionary fervor. Her bathtub, a symbol of her personal comfort, became a coffin for her reputation. In a world where washing was rare and the stench of human life was omnipresent, perfume was not merely a cosmetic accessory, it was an essential tool of survival, a shield, and a weapon. The scents favored by the aristocracy of the 17th and 18th centuries were not the light, floral fragrances we associate with perfume today. They were heavy, potent, and animalic, designed with the express purpose of overwhelming, not just masking, the foul odors of the environment and the unwashed body. The foundational ingredients of these high-status perfumes were derived from animal sources that sound shocking to the modern nose. Musk, a secretion from the preputial gland of the male musk deer; civet, a paste-like substance scraped from the perineal glands of the civet cat; and ambergris, a waxy, malodorous substance harvested from the digestive system of sperm whales, which only becomes fragrant after months or years of floating in the ocean. These substances were prized for their incredible potency and their staying power, their ability to cling to skin and fabric for days. They created a powerful, musky, and frankly fecal aura around the wearer, a scent that was considered intoxicatingly sensual and a powerful signifier of wealth and status, as only the very rich could afford these exotic ingredients. The application of perfume was a crucial part of the daily ritual known as the toilette. After being rubbed down with a dry or lightly dampened cloth, a royal woman would be doused in these powerful scents. Another essential item was the pomander, a small, ornate metal ball, often made of silver or gold, that was worn on a chain from the waist or neck. The pomander was perforated and contained a solid block of fragrant material, typically a mixture of ambergris, musk, civet, and aromatic spices like cloves and nutmeg, all held together with wax. When held to the nose, it provided a moment of personal, fragrant relief from the general stench of a crowded room or a city street. It was a personal air filtration system, a defense against the dreaded miasma. The term eau de toilette, which we still use today, literally translates to toilet water, but its original meaning refers to the water used for this ritual of grooming, the toilette, not for the lavatory. It was a scented water used for dabbing on the skin, a final layer of fragrance to complete the aromatic armor before facing the world. In this context, a person's scent was their signature, a declaration of their place in the social hierarchy, a fragrant fortress against the putrid reality of their world. The crown of a royal woman's head was often quite literally a crowning glory of filth, a meticulously sculpted but rarely washed haven for parasites. The elaborate hairstyles of the 17th and 18th centuries, in particular, represented a zenith of artificiality and a nadir of hygiene. These were not simply coiffures but architectural constructions, towers of hair, both real and false, that rose to astonishing heights above the head. To create these towering styles, a woman's hair was augmented with horsehair pads, wire frames, and vast quantities of hair pieces harvested from the poor. The entire structure was then held together with a thick, sticky pomatum made from rendered animal fat, often bare grease or lard, which acted as a sort of glue. Once the desired shape was achieved, the entire edifice was coated in a thick layer of fine powder, usually made from wheat or rice starch, which gave it the fashionable gray or white appearance. This process was time-consuming and expensive, so a hairstyle was not something to be undone at the end of the day. A woman might keep the same coiffure for weeks, even a month or more, at a time. To sleep, she would have to recline with her neck resting on a special wooden block to avoid crushing the delicate creation. This starchy, greasy, and unwashed mountain of hair quickly became a thriving ecosystem. The animal fat in the pomatum would go rancid, emitting a foul odor. The powder would attract weevils and other insects. And most notoriously, the warm, sheltered environment was an ideal breeding ground for head lice and even, according to some apocryphal but believable tales, nesting mice. The itching would have been maddening, a constant torment hidden beneath the veneer of high fashion. To combat this, special tools were invented. Long, elegant scratching sticks, often made of silver or ivory and sometimes topped with a miniature carved hand, were designed to be delicately inserted into the hairstyle to relieve an itch without disturbing the structure. These were a common and necessary accessory for any fashionable lady. The concept of washing this creation with water was out of the question. It would have destroyed the style and was, as we know, considered unhealthy. The only cleaning that occurred was the periodic reapplication of powder to cover up the grease and dirt. The royal head, adorned with jewels and feathers, was a microcosm of the palace itself, a beautiful, elaborate facade concealing a teeming, vermin-infested, and slowly rotting core. One of the most profound and challenging aspects of a royal woman's life was the management of menstruation, a biological reality shrouded in layers of taboo, superstition, and profound physical discomfort. In an age without disposable sanitary products, managing the monthly flow was a constant and often humiliating struggle. There were no tampons, no adhesive pads. The most common method was to use rags, typically strips of old linen or other soft cloth, which were either pinned to undergarments or held in place with a belt. This is the likely origin of the crude 20th century slang phrase, "on the rag." These cloths were, of course, not disposable. After use, they would have to be washed by laundresses, a deeply private and often shameful task, before being reused the following month. The effectiveness of these makeshift pads was minimal. Leaks were a constant and terrifying possibility, a source of profound anxiety for any woman in a public-facing role, let alone a queen whose every move was scrutinized. The fear of a visible stain on a priceless silk gown, or the subtle but unmistakable odor of menstrual blood, would have been a source of relentless stress. This physical reality was compounded by a heavy weight of cultural and religious baggage. Menstrual blood was widely considered unclean, even poisonous. The ancient Roman scholar Pliny the Elder wrote that contact with a menstruating woman could turn wine sour, cause crops to fail, and blunt the sharpness of steel. These beliefs, in various forms, persisted for centuries. A menstruating woman was often seen as being in a state of ritual impurity, sometimes barred from certain religious ceremonies or even from receiving communion. This created a profound sense of shame and secrecy around a perfectly natural biological function. In the close quarters of a royal court, where gossip was a blood sport, concealing one's cycle would have been a matter of strategic importance. Any sign of irregularity could fuel speculation about a queen's health or, most critically, her fertility. The absence of a period could signal a much hoped-for pregnancy, while its presence could be a crushing public disappointment. A queen's womb was not her own. It was an asset of the state, and its functions were a matter of national concern. Thus, menstruation was not just a hygienic challenge, it was a political and psychological ordeal, a monthly reminder of the vulnerabilities of the female body in a world that both deified and degraded it. a secret war waged with rags and prayers against the inescapable tides of biology. The royal birthing chamber was arguably the most dangerous place in the entire kingdom for a woman, a crucible where the pressure to produce an heir met the brutal ignorance of pre-modern medicine. Childbirth, for a queen, was not a private medical event but a public spectacle and a political necessity. The room would be sealed, windows and doors covered to keep out drafts and the dreaded miasma, creating a hot, stagnant, and unventilated environment. But the room would not be empty. It would be crowded with people, family members, high-ranking ladies, in-waiting, government ministers, and foreign ambassadors, all present to witness the birth and verify the legitimacy of the royal infant. Their presence turned a moment of extreme physical vulnerability into a performance, adding immense psychological stress. Into this crowded, airless room came the physicians and midwives, their hands and instruments bearing the invisible filth of the world outside. The concept of sterilizing instruments or washing hands before a procedure was non-existent. A doctor might come directly from treating a patient with a festering wound or performing an autopsy to attend the queen in labor, bringing with him a deadly cargo of unknown pathogens. The result was an appallingly high rate of puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus that was almost always fatal before the age of antibiotics. A queen could successfully deliver a healthy baby only to die in agony days later from a raging infection, her body consumed by fever. The tragic story of Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, is a textbook example. After a long and arduous labor of 2 days and 3 nights in 1537, she delivered the long-awaited male heir, the future Edward VI. The kingdom rejoiced, but within days, Jane fell ill with a fever and died, a classic case of postpartum infection introduced by her attendants. Her death highlights the brutal paradox of royal life. A woman could hold the highest status in the land, command immense wealth, and have access to the most renowned physicians of her day, and yet her life expectancy during childbirth was no better, and was often worse, than that of a peasant woman giving birth in a cottage. The birthing chamber, intended to be the site of dynastic triumph, was all too often a death sentence, a testament to the fact that no amount of gold or power could protect a woman from the lethal consequences of a world that did not understand the nature of infection. Let us now lean in closer for a conversation with a queen, but be prepared for an olfactory experience that would challenge the strongest constitution. The royal mouth was, in many cases, a cavern of appalling decay, a source of chronic pain, and a generator of truly horrific halitosis. The primary culprit was the aristocratic diet. The advent of refined sugar in Europe, beginning in the late Middle Ages and accelerating into a frenzy by the 17th and 18th centuries, was a disaster for dental health. Sugar was a status symbol, and the wealthy consumed it in vast quantities in sweets, desserts, and even savory dishes. Royal women, like Elizabeth I with her love of marzipan, indulged freely. This constant exposure to sugar, combined with a near-total lack of effective dental hygiene, created the perfect conditions for rampant tooth decay. The concept of brushing teeth was not widespread. Some rudimentary toothpastes existed, often abrasive powders made from things like crushed brick, charcoal, or salt, applied with a cloth or a primitive chew stick. But their use was inconsistent and their effectiveness limited. More common was the use of a toothpick after meals, but this did little to stop the relentless march of cavities. As teeth began to rot, they would turn black, crumble, and break off, leaving painful, jagged stumps. This decay would inevitably lead to abscesses, agonizing pockets of infection that could swell the face to grotesque proportions. The pain would be constant and debilitating, with no effective painkillers beyond alcohol or opiates like laudanum, which brought their own dangers. When a tooth became unbearably painful, the only solution was extraction. This procedure was not performed by a skilled dentist but often by a barber surgeon, a blacksmith, or a traveling tooth drawer at a public fair. There was no anesthetic. The patient was held down while the practitioner used brutal, pliers-like instruments to wrench the tooth from its socket, often breaking the jaw or leaving infected roots behind in the process. The result of this lifelong ordeal was that by middle age, many royal women were missing numerous teeth and suffered from chronic oral infections. The smell emanating from this decay, a foul combination of rotting food, infected gums, and putrefying flesh, would have been powerful and inescapable. In a court environment that depended on close personal conversation and whispered secrets, the stench of a monarch's breath was an intimate and unavoidable reality of power. The very clothes that defined a royal woman's status were also a key component of her deeply flawed hygienic regime. In an era when full body washing was a rare and hazardous event, clothing served as the primary line of defense against the body's own grime. The secret lay in the layers. Next to the skin, a woman would wear a chemise or a shift, a simple, loose-fitting garment made of linen or, for the very wealthy, fine cotton. This was the most important piece of clothing in her wardrobe from a hygienic standpoint. The linen chemise was designed to be absorbent, to soak up the sweat, oils, and dirt produced by the body throughout the day. This garment was changed with relative frequency, perhaps daily or every few days for a queen, while the body it was protecting remained unwashed. This was the essence of pre-modern cleanliness. You did not wash the body, you washed the clothes that touched the body. Above the chemise came the corset or stays, a rigid garment of bone and fabric that sculpted the torso, and then multiple layers of petticoats to create the desired voluminous silhouette. Finally came the magnificent outer gown, the part of the ensemble visible to the world. This gown, made of incredibly expensive and delicate materials like silk, velvet, or brocade, and often elaborately embroidered with gold and silver thread, was almost never cleaned. Water would ruin these fabrics, and the process of dry cleaning had not yet been invented. An outer gown was an investment, worn for years or even decades. It would accumulate a patina of filth, spilled food and wine, sweat stains that soaked through from the layers beneath, and the general dust and grime of the palace. These garments were simply aired out or brushed down, but the underlying dirt and smell remained. Thus, a queen's magnificent attire was essentially a multi-layered sponge. The inner linen layer absorbed the immediate bodily secretions, and this was the clean part. The outer layers, however, were a walking museum of every banquet and crowded event the wearer had ever attended. It creates a strange sensory image. A queen, smelling of powerful, expensive perfume, yet her clothes carrying the faint underlying scent of years of accumulated sweat and spilled wine, a hidden history of her life woven into the very fabric of her finery. The clothes were not just a display of wealth, but a porous, absorbent barrier between a dirty body and a dirty world. The case of Isabella I of Castile offers a fascinating insight into the complex relationship between hygiene, religion, and propaganda. The famous story, that she proudly confessed to having bathed only at her birth and before her wedding, has cemented her in the popular imagination as the archetype of the filthy medieval monarch. However, the truth is likely far more nuanced and politically charged. To understand Isabella's context, we must look at the unique cultural landscape of late 15th century Spain. For centuries, much of the Iberian Peninsula had been under the rule of the Moors, Islamic caliphates with a rich and sophisticated culture. A central part of this culture was a deep appreciation for water and bathing, inherited from the Roman tradition. The Moors built magnificent public bathhouses, or hammams, in their cities, such as Granada and Cordoba. These were not just places for washing but were vital social and community centers. For Isabella and her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, whose entire reign was defined by the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from Muslim rule, every aspect of Moorish culture was politically and religiously suspect. The final victory of the Reconquista came in 1492 with the fall of Granada. The same year they issued the Alhambra decree, expelling all Jews from Spain. And the same year they sponsored Columbus's voyage. This was a period of intense, militant Catholic identity building. In this hyper-politicized environment, practices associated with the vanquished enemy, such as public bathing, were viewed with deep suspicion. The hammam was seen by the Spanish Christians not as a mark of civilization, but as a symbol of Islamic decadence and sensuality, a foreign and corrupting influence. Therefore, for a ruler like Isabella, publicly disavowing the practice of bathing could have been a powerful political statement. It was a way of culturally distinguishing her Christian kingdom from the Moorish past, of aligning herself with the ascetic, anti-hedonistic ideals of a triumphant Catholicism. The infamous quote, "Therefore, even if it was never actually uttered by her," may reflect a real political strategy. It might have been a form of propaganda, either self-generated or created by her supporters, to frame her as the ultimate Christian queen, one who rejected the unclean cleanliness of her enemies in favor of a more spiritual, if physically grimy, form of purity. It transforms the story from a simple tale of poor hygiene into a complex narrative about cultural warfare, where the act of not washing one's body becomes a potent symbol of national and religious identity. The 19th century marked a profound and revolutionary turning point in the long, filthy history of human hygiene, a seismic shift in understanding that would forever change the relationship between people and their environment. The intellectual foundation for this change was the slow and contested death of miasma theory and the dawn of a new, terrifying, and ultimately life-saving idea, germ theory. For centuries, the enemy had been a smell. Now, it was revealed to be an invisible, living organism. This revolution was not the work of a single mind, but a gradual accumulation of evidence from disparate fields. In the battlefields of the Crimean War, in the 1850s, a nurse named Florence Nightingale began to meticulously collect data, demonstrating a clear statistical link between unsanitary conditions in field hospitals and the shockingly high death rates of soldiers. She argued, with mathematical rigor, that fresh air, clean water, and sanitized wards saved lives, directly challenging the military and medical establishment. Her work, though still partially framed within the language of miasma, laid the practical groundwork for a new paradigm of public health. Around the same time, in France, the chemist Louis Pasteur, through his experiments with fermentation and pasteurization, proved that microscopic living organisms were responsible for processes previously thought to be purely chemical. His work debunked the theory of spontaneous generation and established the existence of a microbial world. This was the theoretical breakthrough. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle was provided by the British surgeon Joseph Lister. Inspired by Pasteur's work, Lister hypothesized that these invisible microbes might be the cause of the deadly post-surgical infections that made operating theaters into butcher shops. In the 1860s, he began experimenting with carbolic acid, an antiseptic, to sterilize his surgical instruments and clean wounds. The results were dramatic. Mortality rates plummeted. He had proven that germs caused infection and, more importantly, that they could be killed. The combined impact of Nightingale, Pasteur, and Lister was a Copernican revolution in medicine and daily life. The enemy was no longer a vague, foul-smelling vapor, but a specific, identifiable foe that could be fought with soap, clean water, and chemical disinfectants. This new knowledge would slowly, but inexorably, begin to seep into every corner of society, from the hospital ward to the slum tenement, and eventually into the very heart of the royal palace itself. The long reign of Queen Victoria, from 1837 to 1901, spanned this very period of sanitary revolution, and her court reflected the dramatic shift in values. The world of Victoria and Albert was a universe away from the perfumed squalor of Versailles. The new enemy was dirt, and the new gospel was cleanliness, which became inextricably linked with the core Victorian virtues of morality, piety, and social progress. The phrase, "cleanliness is next to godliness," became a popular maxim, perfectly capturing the new spirit of the age. This was the era of the great sanitary reformers like Edwin Chadwick, whose reports on the foul living conditions of the urban poor spurred massive public works projects to build sewer systems and provide clean water to cities like London. This new obsession with public and private hygiene was championed by Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert. A man with a keen interest in science, technology, and social improvement, Albert was an enthusiastic advocate for modern sanitation. He oversaw the installation of newfangled flushing water closets in Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, replacing the centuries-old system of chamber pots and commodes. He championed projects like the Great Exhibition of 1851, which showcased the latest in industrial and technological innovation, including modern bathroom fixtures. The monarchy, under Victoria and Albert, actively promoted itself as a model of domestic propriety and sanitized living. This was also the era of mass marketing, and companies like Pears Soap used sentimental and aspirational advertising to make soap a household staple, linking their product to the purity of childhood and the moral uprightness of the British Empire. However, the transition was not instantaneous. London, for much of Victoria's reign, was still a notoriously smelly city. The Great Stink of 1858, when a hot summer caused the sewage-filled River Thames to smell so foul that it forced the closure of Parliament, was a powerful reminder of the old world. The court still used perfume, though the trend shifted away from the heavy animalic scents of the past towards lighter, floral fragrances. Victoria herself was personally associated with the scent of orange blossom, which she wore at her wedding. While the Victorian court embraced the new science of sanitation, it did so with a characteristic sense of moral gravity, transforming hygiene from a mere matter of health into a powerful symbol of civilization, respectability, and imperial might. The unwashed monarch of the past was replaced by the sanitized sovereign, a ruler whose personal cleanliness was a reflection of the nation's moral and industrial progress. For all their perceived divinity and separation from the common masses, royal bodies were just as susceptible to the great biological equalizers, disease, plague, and parasites. In fact, their lifestyles often made them more vulnerable. The closed, crowded environments of palaces were perfect incubators for contagious diseases. Smallpox, the speckled monster, was a terrifyingly democratic killer, scarring and killing rich and poor alike. A queen who survived it, like Elizabeth I, was considered lucky, even if she was left with disfiguring scars that required a lifetime of concealment with toxic makeup. Royal families were also uniquely vulnerable to congenital diseases due to centuries of inbreeding. The practice of marrying close relatives to consolidate power and preserve royal blood had devastating genetic consequences, most famously the Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite that afflicted the Spanish royal line, and more lethally, hemophilia, the royal disease, which was passed down from Queen Victoria to many of the royal houses of Europe, including the Russian Romanovs, with tragic political consequences. Then there was the Great Pox, or syphilis, a venereal disease that ravaged Europe from the late 15th century onwards. While often associated with sexual profligacy, the disease could be passed through generations, and its devastating later stages, including insanity and paralysis, cut short many aristocratic lives in secret. The very filth of the palaces also bred disease. Typhus, a bacterial disease spread by body lice, was rampant, known as camp fever or jail fever, because it thrived in crowded, unsanitary conditions like army camps and prisons. It found an equally welcoming home in the louse-infested wigs and rarely washed clothes of the royal court. A high fever that swept through the palace could easily have been typhus, passed from person to person by the parasites they all carried. And of course, there were the internal parasites, tapeworms, roundworms, and flukes, ingested through undercooked meat or contaminated water, living within the royal intestines, contributing to malnutrition and digestive distress. Disease was the ultimate leveler, a force of nature that cared not for crowns or titles. It served as a constant, humbling reminder that for all their power, a queen's body was a fragile vessel of flesh and blood, just as prone to infection, infestation, and decay as the humblest of her subjects. The divine right of kings could be undone by the bite of a common louse, a potent symbol of the ultimate powerlessness of humanity in the face of the microbial world. The long-term health consequences of these centuries of filth and toxic beauty rituals were profound, a silent, cumulative toll exacted upon the bodies of royal women. The daily application of lead-based ceruse and mercury-laced vermilion was a sentence of slow poisoning. The chronic absorption of these heavy metals through the skin would have led to a litany of horrifying ailments. Neurological damage was common, manifesting as tremors, memory loss, sharp mood swings, and a gradual cognitive decline that could easily be mistaken for madness. This poisoning could also lead to infertility or stillbirths, a catastrophic outcome for a queen whose primary duty was to produce a legitimate heir. The constant pressure to provide a successor, coupled with a body being systematically poisoned by its own cosmetic regimen, created a tragic and intensely personal political crisis. The diet, rich in sugar and meat but often lacking in fresh fruits and vegetables, especially during winter months, led to other chronic conditions. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was not just a sailor's malady, it could affect the wealthy as well, causing bleeding gums, tooth loss, and extreme fatigue. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, could lead to bone deformities. The physical structure of the body itself was often warped by the demands of fashion. Years spent laced into rigid, bone-enforced corsets, designed to create an unnaturally slender waist, could permanently deform the rib cage and displace internal organs, leading to breathing difficulties and digestive problems. Beyond the purely physical, one can only imagine the psychological toll of living in a state of constant, low-level physical discomfort. The maddening itch of lice, the chronic pain of rotting teeth, the cramping of ill-fitting corsets, the constant anxiety over bodily odors and menstrual leaks, this was the daily reality. This relentless physical stress would have inevitably impacted a queen's temperament, her political judgment, and her personal relationships. How could one effectively govern a country while suffering from the delirium of lead poisoning or the agony of a dental abscess? The physical state of the royal body was not separate from the state of the nation. It was intrinsically linked. The decay of the flesh, hidden beneath layers of silk and lead paint, often mirrored a hidden decay in the political body, a poignant symbolism of a power that was ultimately built on a fragile and rotting foundation. So why, after centuries of progress, are we so morbidly fascinated by the squalor of our ancestors? What is the source of this macabre pull, this desire to peer into the unwashed, lice-infested world of kings and queens? Part of the appeal is undoubtedly a form of schadenfreude, a guilty pleasure in discovering that the lives of the rich and powerful were, in some fundamental ways, far more wretched than our own. Learning that a queen had rotten teeth or smelled terrible serves to humanize her, but also to knock her off the pedestal of history. It is a comforting, democratizing thought, a reminder that for all their gilded splendor, they could not escape the fundamental, messy realities of the human body. This fascination also serves as a powerful yardstick for our own progress. By confronting the filth of the past, we reaffirm the comforts and conveniences of the present. Our daily hot showers, flushing toilets, and effective medicines are thrown into sharp relief. It is a form of historical tourism that makes us profoundly grateful to be living in the now, creating a sense of superiority over the supposedly more primitive past. Yet, there is a deeper, more philosophical current at play. These stories speak to a timeless anxiety about the fragility of the human body and the illusion of control. They reveal the profound vulnerability that lies at the heart of even the greatest power. A monarch who could command armies and shape nations was ultimately powerless against a microscopic bacterium or the slow creep of lead poisoning. This resonates with our own modern anxieties, our awareness that despite our technological prowess, we are still subject to disease, aging, and death. There is also an element of the grotesque, the same impulse that draws us to horror films or true crime stories. The descriptions of rancid pomatum, composting floors, and toxic makeup tap into a primal sense of revulsion and curiosity. It is the allure of the abject, the desire to look at that which we are supposed to turn away from. In the end, excavating the history of royal hygiene is not just about unearthing disgusting facts. It is about confronting the profound otherness of the past, and in doing so, holding up a mirror to ourselves, our own vanities, our own anxieties about cleanliness and decay, and our own complex relationship with the beautiful, resilient, and endlessly disgusting vessel that is the human body. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. We began our journey in a perfumed, poisoned chamber, and it is here, in the realm of illusion, that we must conclude. The story of royal hygiene is the story of a monumental, centuries-long effort to construct a flawless facade over a foundation of filth and decay. The white lead paint, the powerful animalic perfumes, the towering powdered wigs, the magnificent unwashed gownsole were tools in the creation of an image, the projection of a body politic that was pure, strong, and divinely ordained. This grand illusion was a necessary component of power. To admit to the squalid, painful, and undignified realities of the flesh would be to admit a vulnerability that the mystique of monarchy could not afford. The true history, the one written in layers of grime and records of disease, has been deliberately scrubbed from the popular narrative, replaced by a sanitized fantasy of fairy tale castles and pristine princesses. We have, in our collective memory, done to history what these queens could not do for themselves. We have given it a thorough washing. We prefer the image of Elizabeth the Gloriana to the reality of a woman in pain from her blackened teeth. We prefer the tragic romance of Marie Antoinette to the thought of her navigating the urine-stained halls of Versailles. This enduring illusion speaks to our own needs, our desire for stories that are grander, cleaner, and more noble than the messy truth of human existence. But the real story, the disgusting story, is the more vital one. It is a powerful antidote to the hagiography of power. It reminds us that history is not made by demigods, but by fragile, flawed, and often very smelly human beings. The gap between the gilded image and the putrid reality is where the most profound truths about power, society, and human nature are found. And it serves as a timeless caution to always question the pristine surface, to look for the decay that lies beneath the veneer, and to remember that the most magnificent thrones have always rested on a simple, inescapable foundation of dirt.